As the Oak Haven Harvest Festival roared with forced cheer, Marlene stood frozen behind the cider tents, a smoking flare gun trembling in her hand and her daughter Avery sobbing at her feet. Across from them, the local sheriff didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he calmly tossed Marlene's final hope, the flash drive and the ledger, into a burning trash barrel. As the evidence of a decade of theft and toxic secrets turned to ash, the sheriff leaned in with a jagged smile and whispered, "Silas told me you were delusional, Marlene. Now, the whole town is going to watch you prove him right." With her bank accounts frozen and the most powerful men in the county standing over her, Marlene realized the physical evidence wasn't just gone. It had been a lure. She was being dragged toward the festival stage, not for an award, but for a public institutionalization that would bury her alive. But as the sheriff's hand clamped onto her bruised arm, he didn't notice the library's high-sensitivity microphone clipped to her lapel, still pulsing with a tiny, rhythmic red light. One question remained. Could a silenced librarian broadcast the truth before the stage lights went dark? The attic air clung to Marlene's skin, thick with the scent of mildew and something older. Damp wood, maybe, or the ghost of mothballs long since crumbled to dust. She crouched, fingers digging into the insulation's brittle fibers, each strand snapping like dry twigs under her nails. The attic floor groaned beneath her knees, a sound that made her teeth clench. Too loud. If Silas heard, if he realized she wasn't just tidying up, as she'd claimed, the fragile piece of the house would shatter. She pushed aside a heavy roll of fiberglass, the pink fibers itching against her forearms, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. This was the spot. She remembered her mother's eyes darting toward this corner in those final, morphine-blurred weeks. "Under the dust, Marlene," she had whispered. "Where the light doesn't reach." Her fingers fumbled against a seam in the floorboards. It was barely wider than a thumbnail, but unmistakable once found. She pried at it with her house key, the metal biting into the wood until the plank lifted with a shuddering groan. Inside, the compartment yawned, dark and shallow, its edges lined with cobwebs that stuck to her wrists like spider silk. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She reached in, her skin crawling, as she brushed against something cold and hard. It wasn't just a box. It was a grave of secrets. She pulled it out, her pulse thrumming in her ears so loudly it drowned out the distant hum of the evening cicadas. The object was a ledger, its leather cover cracked with age, the spine split in places where the stitching had given way. It was heavy, weighted with the gravity of decades. Marlene's pulse hammered in her throat as she lifted it into the dim light of the single, fly-specked bulb hanging from the rafters. The pages resisted at first, sticking together with the stubbornness of the forgotten, then parted with a dry whisper. Her mother's handwriting slanted across the lines, precise and unyielding, numbers marching in neat columns that told a story far different from the one Silas had spun. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the dates. 1998, 2005, 2012. Neat entries for repairs and taxes suddenly gave way to jagged, frantic notes in the margins. Then she saw it. Silas's name, scrawled in a hand that wasn't her mother's. Large withdrawals, transfers to Jacob's development that totaled more than the entire value of the estate. Marlene's stomach twisted. The garage had burned down that summer of '98, and Silas had claimed the insurance money was tied up in probate. But here, in black and white, were the payouts. He hadn't just been managing the estate. He had been harvesting it, stripping the marrow from the bones of her family's history to feed his own insatiable greed. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. For years, She had lived in a state of carefully maintained ignorance, allowing Silas to handle the burdensome details of their finances while she retreated into the quiet stacks of the library. She had trusted him when he said the inheritance was gone, consumed by her mother's medical bills and the rising costs of property taxes. She had felt guilty for even questioning him. But the ledger didn't lie. It documented a systematic, decade-long theft. Every vacation Silas had surprised her with, every investment that had supposedly fallen through. It had all been paid for with her mother's blood and her father's sweat. She sat on the dusty floor, the ledger clutched to her chest, feeling the cold weight of the truth. She wasn't just a librarian in a small town. She was a woman standing in the middle of a wreckage she had helped build through her own silence. She began to compare the entries to her own meager records, her mind working with the clinical efficiency of a cataloger. The patterns emerged like ink in water. Silas wasn't just losing money. He was funneling it into a series of shell companies, each one a failing real estate scheme designed to hide the original theft. It was a house of cards, and she was holding the one piece of paper that could bring it all down. The house below remained silent, but the silence felt predatory now. Marlene knew she couldn't stay here. She needed someone who understood the language of numbers better than she did. She thought of Sarah Thompson. They had grown up together. Two girls who dreamt of leaving Oakhaven but found themselves anchored to its soil. Sarah was at the bank now, high enough in the hierarchy to see things others couldn't. Marlene wrapped the ledger in an old sweater, tucking it into her bag with trembling hands. She had to move. She had to act before the cold clarity in her chest turned back into the paralyzing fear she had lived with for 20 years. The drive to the Oakhaven Bank was a blur of golden hour shadows and the smell of cooling asphalt. The town looked the same as it always did. Picturesque, sleepy, a postcard of rural stability. But to Marlene, the peeling paint on the storefronts now looked like scabs. She parked 3 blocks away, her sensible shoes clicking on the pavement as she hurried toward the brick building. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a sweetness that felt cloying. She entered the lobby, the heavy brass handles of the doors feeling cold and slick under her palms. Sarah was behind the counter, her face lighting up with a genuine smile that made Marlene's throat ache. "Marlene, you look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah whispered, leaning over the polished marble. Marlene didn't answer. She just gripped her bag tighter. Sarah's smile faltered, her sharp eyes taking in the dust on Marlene's cardigan and the frantic set of her jaw. Without a word, Sarah signaled to a junior teller and led Marlene toward a private office in the back. The room was small, windowless, and smelled of lemon oil and old paper. A sanctuary of sorts. "I found it," Marlene said, her voice a low, husky rasp as she pulled the ledger from her bag. She laid it on the mahogany desk between them. Sarah frowned, her capable hands reaching for the book. As she turned the pages, the silence in the room grew heavy, punctuated only by the distant, mechanical ka-ching of a cash register in the lobby. Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to professional focus, then finally to a grim, cold anger. She pulled up a series of internal records on her computer, her fingers flying across the keys. "Marlene?" Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave. "These withdrawal slips, the signatures on the quitclaim deeds for the North property, they aren't your mother's, and they certainly aren't yours." She turned the monitor so Marlene could see. The signatures were elaborate, perfect imitations of her mother's elegant script. But under the high-resolution scan, the hesitation in the ink was visible. The tremble of the forger, as Sarah called it. Silas hadn't just stolen the money. He had erased Marlene's legal existence to do it. The confirmation was a jagged glass shard in Marlene's heart. She had signed papers Silas put in front of her, yes, but she had never signed these. He had forged her consent, her identity, her life. "I need copies, Sarah," Marlene said, her voice steadying. "I need everything you can find." Sarah nodded, her jaw set. "I can't give you the originals, but I can give you a drive. Encrypted. If anyone asks, you are here to discuss a small personal loan." She began the transfer, the small red light on the flash drive blinking like a warning heartbeat. Marlene left the bank through the rear service exit, wanting to avoid the scrutiny of the main street. The alley was narrow, a canyon of grimy brick and rusted dumpsters that smelled of rotting produce and wet concrete. The shadows here were long and jagged. She had only taken 10 steps when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of wooden pallets, blocking her path. It was Miller, Silas's construction foreman. He was a mountain of a man, his face a map of old scars and permanent scowl, smelling of sweat and cheap tobacco. "Marlene," he growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very air. "Silas is looking for you. Said you took something that didn't belong to you." He stepped closer, his massive bulk casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. He reached for her bag, his fingers thick and scarred. Marlene stepped back, her heel catching on an uneven brick. The fear she had expected didn't come. Instead, a hot, white-hot spark of rage ignited in her gut. She wasn't going back to the dark. She wasn't going back to being invisible. "Get out of my way, Miller," she said, her voice thinning into a razor-sharp edge. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound, and lunged for her. Marlene didn't think, she reacted. She reached into her bag and swung her heavy professional cataloging scanner, a solid piece of equipment she'd brought from the library to scan the ledger. The metal corner caught Miller squarely in the temple. There was a sickening thud, and the big man stumbled, his eyes glazing over as he let out a grunt of pure shock. He hit the brick wall, sliding down into the grime, his hands clutching his head. Marlene didn't wait for him to recover. She turned and bolted toward the end of the alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't head for her car. Miller would expect that. Instead, she sprinted toward the Oak Haven Public Library, the one place where she knew every shadow and every creak of the floorboards. She burst through the side entrance, the cool, musty air of the stacks enveloping her like a shroud. She ducked into the history section, crouching behind a towering oak shelf, her heart hammering against the leather of her bag. The library was nearly empty, the only sound the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the lobby. Marlene stayed perfectly still, listening. After a few minutes, the front doors creaked open. Heavy footsteps, not Miller's, but more deliberate, echoed on the marble. Silas. He didn't call out. He just walked, the slow, measured pace of a predator who knew his prey was cornered. Marlene moved silently, gliding through the labyrinth of shelves she had tended for 15 years. She knew which boards groaned and which hinges hissed. She made her way to the archives on the second floor, the wrought iron spiral staircase trembling slightly under her weight. In the flickering greenish glow of the fluorescent lights, she pulled out a laptop and plugged in the flash drive Sarah had given her. The files opened. Deeds, bank transfers, and something she hadn't expected. The name of the notary. Robert Vance. Her blood ran cold. Robert had been Avery's boyfriend years ago, a charming, slick young man Marlene had never liked. Silas hadn't just used strangers. He had corrupted the people closest to them, turning their family's social circle into a web of complicity. The betrayal felt total. Silas had been planning this for years, weaving a tapestry of lies that involved her daughter, her friends, and her town. She stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her pale green eyes. She wasn't just fighting for her money anymore. She was fighting for her soul and for the soul of Oakhaven. But as she heard Silas's footsteps reaching the bottom of the spiral stairs, she realized the fight had only just begun. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to finish what he had started in that attic. "What, Marlene?" Silas's voice drifted up, rich and warm, the voice he used when he wanted to convince the town council to approve a new development. "Honey, let's not make a scene. You're stressed. Everyone knows you haven't been yourself since your mother passed." The mockery in his tone was a physical weight. He was already building the narrative of her instability. He didn't need to kill her. He just needed to make sure no one believed her. She closed the laptop, her fingers trembling but her mind sharp. She had the evidence, but Silas had the power. He had the sheriff, the council, and the town's respect. She was just the quiet librarian who spent too much time with her books. But Silas had made one fatal mistake. He had forgotten that librarians knew where all the secrets were buried. And Marlene Jacobs was done being quiet. She tucked the drive into her pocket, took a deep breath of the dust and old paper, and prepared to step out of the shadows. The confrontation in the library ended not with a bang, but with a cold, terrifying promise. Silas didn't try to grab her. He simply stood at the top of the stairs, his dark eyes flat and pitiless. "There's a hearing, Marlene. Monday morning. Mental competency. I've already spoken to the council. They're concerned. We all are." He smiled then, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "Go home. Get some rest. You're going to need it." Marlene walked past him, her shoulder brushing his tailored suit, her skin crawling at the contact. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The war was declared. She drove home in a trance, the familiar streets of Oakhaven feeling like a foreign country. When she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something odd. The house looked dark, even for this time of night. She stepped inside and reached for the wall switch. Nothing. She tried the kitchen light. Silence. She picked up the wall phone in the hallway, pressing it to her ear. No dial tone, just a hollow, dead silence. She walked to the back of the house, her heart beginning that frantic rhythm again, and looked at the exterior wall. The phone lines had been cut, the wires dangling like severed nerves against the white siding. Silas was isolating her, cutting the threads that connected her to the world. She was a ghost in her own home, and the walls were closing in. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. She ran to the garage, needing the safety of her car, the ability to flee. But when she swung the heavy wooden door open, the smell hit her first. The acrid, rubbery scent of ruined tires. In the beam of her flashlight, she saw them. All 4 tires on her sedan had been systematically slashed, the rubber gaping like open wounds. She was trapped. Silas had turned her sanctuary into a prison, and he hadn't even had to lock the doors. She stood in the center of the garage, the flashlight beam shaking in her hand. The silence of the night felt heavy, a physical pressure against her eardrums. She thought of her mother's cottage on the outskirts of town, a tiny, whitewashed place surrounded by the encroaching woods. It was the only place Silas hadn't touched yet. She threw a few essentials into a backpack, the ledger, the flash drive, a change of clothes, and stepped out into the night. She wouldn't take the roads. She knew the back trails, the deer paths that wound through the hills, the places where the shadows were thickest. The walk was grueling. The humidity clung to her, her silver-streaked hair damp against her neck. Every snap of a twig made her freeze, her eyes darting toward the dark wall of the forest. She felt like a child again, playing hide-and-seek in the woods. But this time the stakes weren't a scraped knee or a missed dinner. This time, the person seeking her wanted to erase her from existence. She reached the cottage after 2 hours, her lungs burning, her sensible shoes ruined by the mud. The cottage was a dark smudge against the trees. She fumbled for the spare key hidden in the base of a ceramic gnome, her fingers slick with sweat. But as she reached for the door, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the whitewashed walls. A truck engine rumbled, low and menacing. Silas. He had known she would come here. He had been waiting. The truck door creaked open, and Silas stepped out, his silhouette framed by the harsh glare of the high beams. "Marlene, enough," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I have the papers. I have the doctor waiting. We're going to get you the help you need." He walked toward her, his steps confident, ownership in every movement. He reached for her arm, his grip tightening like a vice. "Don't make me use force, honey. Think of how it will look." Marlene's gaze darted to the small garden shed near the porch. She twisted her arm, the fabric of her cardigan tearing, and lunged. She grabbed the first thing her hand touched, a heavy, rusted tire iron leaning against the shed wall. As Silas reached for her again, she swung. She didn't hit him, but the iron connected with the truck's driver's side headlight with a spectacular, glass-shattering crack. The darkness rushed back in as the light died. In the sudden confusion, Marlene didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted into the woods, the tire iron still gripped in her hand. She heard Silas shouting behind her, the sound of his boots crashing through the underbrush. But she didn't look back. She knew these woods better than he ever would. She plunged into a thicket of pine, the needles scratching her face, and vanished into the heart of the forest. She ran until her heart felt like it would burst, finally collapsing into a hollow log near a stream she remembered from childhood. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and rot. She stayed there for hours, listening to the forest breathe. As the moon rose, she noticed something tucked deep into the hollow of the log. A weather-beaten leather satchel. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed from Silas to someone named V. She read them by the light of her phone, her breath hitching. They weren't just business letters. They were desperate pleas for more time, more money. Silas was drowning in debt, millions of dollars owed to a silent partner who was funding his lifestyle. And the price of that funding? The letters spoke of disposal, of the ravine, of making the land profitable. Marlene felt a sick dread coil in her stomach. She followed a faint, chemical odor she'd noticed earlier, moving toward the edge of the town's watershed. She found it in a hidden clearing. Unmarked trucks, their engines muffled, dumping rusted metal barrels into a deep ravine that led directly to the town's primary water source. The barrels bore no labels, but the earth around them was a sickly, iridescent yellow. Silas wasn't just a thief, he was a poisoner. His real estate business was a front for a massive, illegal, toxic waste dumping scheme. The silent partner wasn't just an investor. He was an accomplice in an environmental massacre. Marlene crouched behind a gnarled oak, her phone out, documenting everything. The serial numbers on the barrels, the license plates of the trucks, the way the oily liquid seeped into the soil. She realized then that the competency hearing wasn't just about the money. It was about silence. If she was institutionalized, she could never testify. She could never tell the town that their community leader was killing them for a profit. She felt a cold, hard resolve settle over her. She couldn't just run. She had to destroy him. She had to take the truth and hammer it into the heart of Oakhaven until the facade shattered. She began the long trek back toward town, the weight of the backpack no longer a burden, but a weapon. She needed an ally, someone who wasn't bought, someone who still believed that Oakhaven was worth saving. And she knew exactly where to go. The morning of the Harvest Festival arrived with a deceptive, golden warmth that felt like a mockery. Marlene hadn't slept for 36 hours. Her clothes were stained with mud and pine resin, her silver hair a wild tangle, but her eyes were sharp, glowing with a feverish intensity. She tried to check into the Oakhaven motel, needing a place to wash the forest from her skin. But the clerk, a woman she'd known for years, looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. "I'm sorry, Marlene," the woman whispered, sliding her credit card back across the counter. "The bank, they called. All your accounts are frozen. Court order." Marlene stared at the plastic card. Silas had moved faster than she'd anticipated. He had paralyzed her financially, leaving her a beggar in her own town. She walked out into the street, the sounds of the festival beginning to rise, the distant thump of a marching band, the smell of frying dough, the high-pitched laughter of children. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She wandered the festival grounds, watching from the shadows as Silas stood on the VIP balcony of the town hall, laughing with the mayor and the sheriff. He looked perfect, a pillar of the community, while she was a tattered remnant. Resentment, thick and bitter as bile, rose in her throat. She was the one who had stayed. She was the one who had cared for the elderly, who had kept the library's history alive, who had loved this town even when it didn't love her back. And now, they were all cheering for the man who was poisoning them. "Mom?" The voice was small, hesitant, but it cut through the noise of the crowd like a bell. Marlene turned and saw a woman standing near a cider stall. She was tall, wiry, with a leather jacket and the same pale green eyes Marlene saw in the mirror every morning. Avery. Her daughter, who had run away at 16 and never looked back, was standing there, her face a map of shock and burgeoning grief. They embraced in the shadow of a tent, the contact so sudden and intense that Marlene felt her knees buckle. Avery didn't ask questions. She just held her mother, her hands rough and capable. "I heard," Avery whispered into Marlene's hair. "I heard what he was doing. I saw the news about the hearing. I came as soon as I could." She pulled back, her jaw set in the same stubborn line as Marlene's. "I'll testify, Mom. I'll tell them about the night he hit me. I'll tell them about the notary. He's not going to win." For the first time in weeks, Marlene felt a flicker of hope. With Avery's testimony, the unstable narrative would crumble. But the hope was short-lived. A shadow fell over them. Miller, his temple still bruised from Marlene's scanner, stood 10 feet away with 2 other men. They didn't have to say a word. They began to close in, their intentions clear. "Run!" Marlene hissed, grabbing Avery's hand. They wove through the crowded fairgrounds, ducking behind game booths, and through the thick, cloying smoke of the barbecue pits. The festival was a kaleidoscope of noise and color that felt like a trap. They reached the storage area behind the main stage, a labyrinth of equipment crates and coiled cables, only to find themselves blocked by a towering chain-link fence. There was no way out. Miller stepped into the light, a heavy wrench in his hand. "Silas wants you both," he said, his voice flat. "He says it's time to go home." Marlene's gaze darted around the storage area. She saw a small, orange plastic tube tucked into an emergency kit on a nearby boat display. A flare gun. She lunged for it, her fingers fumbling with the latch. As Miller stepped forward, his hand outstretched, she pulled the trigger. The world turned white. The flare erupted with a deafening whoosh, a blinding streak of crimson light that hissed through the air, narrowly missing Miller's head and exploding against a wooden crate behind him. The sudden heat and noise were overwhelming. Miller and his men scrambled back, shielding their eyes, the smell of magnesium and burning wood filling the air. "Over here!" a voice boomed. Sheriff Callahan stepped out of the shadows of the stage, his hand on his holster, his face a mask of stern authority. "Miller, back off. Now!" The foreman hesitated, then signaled his men to retreat into the darkness. Callahan turned to Marlene and Avery, his expression softening into something that looked like concern. "Marlene, Avery, thank God. Come with me. We need to get you somewhere safe." Marlene felt a wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy. She followed the sheriff into his private office at the edge of the festival grounds, her hands shaking as she pulled the ledger and the flash drive from her bag. "Sheriff, you have to see this," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "The embezzlement, the toxic waste, it's all here. Silas and the council, they've been—" She stopped. The sheriff wasn't looking at the ledger. He was looking at her with a cold, pitying smile that made the hair on her arms stand up. He took the flash drive from the desk and dropped it onto the floor. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he ground his heavy boot into the plastic until it shattered into 100 useless pieces. Marlene watched in horror. What are you doing?" Callahan didn't answer. He picked up the leather-bound ledger, her mother's life, the only physical proof she had left, and tossed it into a metal trash bin. He struck a match, the flame small and orange in the dim office, and dropped it onto the dry, yellowed pages. The fire caught instantly, the smell of burning leather filling the room. "I'm the silent partner, Marlene," Callahan said, his voice low and steady. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to run a county? How much it costs to keep a town like this from falling apart? Silas provided the land. I provided the protection. It was a perfect arrangement until you started digging." The door opened, and Silas stepped in, looking as polished and untouchable as ever. He looked at Marlene, slumped in the chair, and then at the burning bin. "Poor Marlene," he said, his voice a mocking caress. The stress finally broke her. Setting fire to her own mother's records, attacking people with flares. It's a tragedy, really. He slid a set of papers across the desk toward the sheriff. "The emergency commitment order. Sign it, Robert. Let's get her the help she needs before she hurts anyone else." Marlene looked from the fire to the men standing over her. She was stripped of everything, her money, her evidence, her reputation. She was trapped in a room with the two most powerful men in the county, and they were about to erase her. She felt the darkness closing in, the suffocating weight of Oak Haven's secrets finally winning. She looked at Avery, who was being held by a deputy in the corner, and saw the same terror in her daughter's eyes. This was the end. Silas had won. The trash chute of her life felt like it had finally opened, and Marlene was sliding toward the bottom. Silas's hand was heavy on her shoulder as he guided her toward the back of the festival stage. The sounds of the crowd outside were a dull roar, a celebratory ocean that didn't know it was drowning. "Just a few more minutes, Marlene," Silas whispered into her ear, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and mint. "Then the ambulance will be here. You'll be safe. You'll be quiet." He stepped away, adjusting his tie, and strode onto the stage to a thunderous wave of applause. The mayor was speaking, his voice booming through the speakers. For his tireless dedication to our community, for his vision and his heart, We present the Community Service Award to Silas Jacobs. Marlene stood in the wings, a guard's hand firm on her arm. Her gaze darted around the equipment-cluttered space, landing on a small, glowing screen near a stack of soundboard crates. A volunteer's tablet, left charging and unattended. A spark of something, not hope, but a cold librarian's instinct, flickered in her mind. Silas had destroyed the physical evidence, the amateur proof. But he had forgotten one thing. Marlene had spent 15 years managing the town's digital archives. She knew the back doors of every server in Oak Haven. "I need to use the restroom," she whispered to the guard, her voice trembling with a well-acted fragility. The man hesitated, looking at her disheveled state, then nodded toward a small portable unit 10 feet away. As he turned his head for a split second to check the stage, Marlene didn't go for the restroom. She lunged for a stack of heavy stage weights, kicking them over with a spectacular crash. The guard jumped, his attention diverted by the noise. In that heartbeat, Marlene scrambled for the tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen, her mind a map of administrative codes and remote access protocols. She didn't need the flash drive. She had uploaded her own encrypted backups to the library's cloud server days ago. Not just the deeds, but the audio she'd captured with the library's high-sensitivity bird-watching microphones near the ravine. She logged in, the access granted message a green beacon of salvation. She didn't wait. She used the tablet's interface to hijack the stage's wireless projector system. On the giant screen behind Silas, the promotional slideshow of his accomplishments suddenly flickered and died. A low, distorted hiss filled the festival grounds, drowning out the mayor's speech. Then, a voice, unmistakable, arrogant and clear, boomed through the massive speakers. "The ravine's deep enough, Robert. Another 50 barrels and the debt's clear. Who's gonna know? The town's too stupid to check the water until they're all glowing in the dark." The crowd went deathly silent. Silas froze on the podium, his hand still outstretched for the award, his face drained of color. The recording continued, the sound of his and the sheriff's laughter echoing like a death knell over the silent thousands. "And Marlene?" the sheriff's voice asked on the recording. "Marlene's a ghost," Silas's voice replied. "By Monday, she'll be in a padded cell, and the library can have her books. I've already moved the elderly fund into the development account. They're paying for their own funeral, they just don't know it yet." Marlene stepped out from behind the curtain, standing tall in the harsh white glare of the spotlights. She wasn't the tattered victim anymore. She was the witness. She held the tablet high, the screen displaying the scanned bank transfers, the systematic liquidation of the town's retirement accounts, scrolling for everyone to see. The silence of the crowd broke not with a cheer, but with a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. It was the sound of a town waking up. Silas tried to speak, his mouth working like a landed fish. But the sound was drowned out as the townspeople surged toward the stage. He looked toward the wings for the sheriff, but Callahan was already being intercepted by 3 state troopers who had been alerted by Avery's frantic calls from the cider tents. The Community Service Award fell to the wooden floorboards with a hollow clack. Marlene felt a hand on hers. Avery was there, her face wet with tears, but her eyes bright with a fierce, proud light. They stood together on the stage as the conspirators were led away in handcuffs, the festive lanterns of Oak Haven finally illuminating the truth. Weeks later, the air over the cottage was different. The cloying chemical scent had faded, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of autumn rain and pine. Marlene sat on the porch, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the morning mist lift over the woods. The legal injunctions were gone. The estate was secure. But more than that, the silence in the house was no longer predatory. It was peaceful. Avery came out, 2 mugs in her hands, and sat on the steps. They didn't need to talk about the trials or the remediation teams working at the ravine. They just watched the light change. Marlene looked at her hands, no longer ink-stained, no longer trembling. She had spent her life trying to disappear, but in the end, it was the act of being seen that had saved her. The shadow of Silas Jacobs was gone, and for the first time in 38 years, Marlene Jacobs was finally home.